I can hear you. Okay, so this is one of the older ones. Okay, so what if when you're picking, you have no idea you're doing it until you look down or someone else tells you? So I suppose you're talking about mindless or automatic picking. Um, this is a little bit trickier to deal with than than the focused picking, because obviously you don't know what's happening. So your first step would be to bring in more awareness in your body, and specifically in your hands, so that you notice when your hands reach towards your face or whatever the picking side may be. There are several ways that you can do that. You can use the app that I mentioned in the beginning. And so when someone tells you or you realize that you're doing it, you pause and then make an entry into the app. And then you will slowly start to see the patterns. Another thing that you can do that's very practical is wear a very noisy bracelet or a very heavy bracelet, and that will automatically make you more aware of your arm. There's, of course, another way that you can deal with it, which is to invest in a habit-aware bracelet, which will make a noise every time you start picking. Habit-aware bracelets are very useful to make you more aware of picking, but they're not, of course, the whole solution, but they are very good as part of habit reversal training. So those are some of the things that I would recommend. Picking self-harm. So picking is distinctly different from self-harm. However, sometimes they can overlap. So I wouldn't call it self-harm, but in certain situations, you can see that the two behaviors sort of coalesce in the same thing. So the need to pick your skin and self-harm can combine into one behavior, but they are two different things. I found my skin picking severely increased when I take stimulant drugs, particularly cocaine. Is there a reason this may be? Would it be related to emotions, or is it something else at play here? It's so intense, I often leave large bloody scabs in places where I didn't even have marks before I started to pick. I'm aware this is a coping mechanism for my wider issues, and I'm working on my use of drugs. So yes, if you take cocaine, I can imagine that you can pick a lot more and also be more anxious, because it is a stimulant drug. Cocaine sort of hyperactivates your sympathetic nervous system, which means that you will react anxiously to even the slightest things. And even when sort of most of the visible effects of cocaine wear off, you will still stay more reactive and slightly more anxious. It's almost like you're constantly prepared for danger. You're very jumpy. That's what it works. Your fight or flight response is very easily activated when you're on cocaine. So that's why you will pick more. You will be triggered by things that most in let's say, standard conditions, you wouldn't even notice. So that's why. And I would have to say that you can use competing responses, you can wear gloves, you can do stuff like that. But in my experience, if you're still experiencing more intense effects of cocaine, you're very likely not to even apply competing responses. So what I would do is primarily focus on sort of tapering off or entirely stopping the use of cocaine. So I would say that for you, before you actually address skin picking, perhaps a wiser and more useful thing is to work on the issues that are causing you to use cocaine in the first place. So that way, when you remove that, you will be able to deal with skin picking more efficiently. But I would not expect you to have control over skin picking while on cocaine, to be quite honest. It's just more of a biological thing. That's what I know. Marina's experience would be so much more confronting for the participant than interacting with a screen that is pre-programmed to react to movements. One would feel in control for the screen as it is predictable. Marina's response is less so. Yes, and I think this is exactly what. So I'm not. I don't know how exactly the sculpture was programmed. I enjoyed the aesthetics of it and the idea of it, but not. I don't know the part. But yes, one thing about interacting with other humans is you never know what's going to arise. And this is why many people will be slightly anxious before, for example, meeting new people. You never know where it's going to go. But on the other hand, it's that jump into the unknown, that openness towards anxiety is what changes us, what gives us more experience, and ultimately makes us calmer and more still. So there is a kind of paradox that in order to become stronger, different, more stable, we have to embrace anxiety, not fight it. And I think Marina's performance really shows that beautifully. I read an encounter, this girl wrote an essay about sitting across from Marina, and she said how at first she was very skeptical, but then she found herself just sort of like she knew who Marina Abramovich was and she had a lot of respect for her, but when she started looking at her, she realized that across from her is not some famous artist, icon, legend, none of that. It's just this vulnerable woman. And then suddenly her guard dropped, and then she became very, very emotional as well. So that's the beauty of our interactions, and that's why emotions are always inevitable. There's no way to control them entirely. There's just a way of understanding them and working with them. But for me, that's a part of the beauty of being human, actually, is that we have to embrace anxiety and sort of just surrender to it. Can you please repeat who the person was who talked about how the distinction between mind and body is because that's how we categorize it? Oh, that's George Kelly. That was the man on the picture, American psychologist. But it's not, if you go by that logic, it's not just Kelly. There's a lot of psychology and philosophy around it. Actually, in the last 10 years or so, a lot of psychological research is directed at something called embodied cognition, which is essentially overcoming the mind-body dualism. Kelly came first, and he's unjustly neglected, so I like to sort of point out how Kelly was a pioneer. But we didn't start thinking, I think, in philosophy as mind and body being separated between Descartes, for example. Before that, we had slightly different conceptualizations of it, and afterwards as well. As you can see from what I was talking about grounding our emotions in the body, it's really a mix of things. Mind and body is a very useful distinction to make because there are some things that are obviously better explained as being psychological, for example, than being physiological. But at the end of the day, it's just a distinction. It's just a construct that we have invented because it's useful. Sometimes it would be useful to abandon it. Sometimes it's useful to embrace it. Kelly was very pragmatic about these things. So I hope that helps. If skin picking is a response to emotions such as guilt, is the aim to address the reasons for the emotion or find another coping mechanism or both? So I tried not to use the word coping mechanism because, again, it sort of pathologizes the emotion itself. There's nothing wrong about being anxious or feeling guilt. That's just a normal part of being human. For me, it's about making the best out of the emotion. I guess if that's what you mean by coping, then that's what it is. I wouldn't also say that picking is caused by the inability to deal with emotions, but in some cases that may be the main thing. Sometimes it's a contributing factor, but usually experiential avoidance of some sorts is an important part. I would always do both of the things you suggested. I would always address the reasons because that's how we learn and do better. And I would also find different ways to relate to my guilt because there's a difference between seeing guilt as punishment and seeing guilt as an information, isn't there? If I feel guilty and say, yes, that's the just punishment I get, I basically cling to that guilt and then amplify its effects. And consequently, I amplify my own suffering. But if I approach guilt as, this is information telling me that I messed up something, that kind of invites me to be a better person. There's no virtue in feeling guilt, unless you consider masochism of something that's a virtue. But there is virtue in being a better person, which you do by analyzing guilt and then trying not to make the same mistakes again. So to me, that's quite a different approach. The author's name is George Kelly. Yes, George Alexander Kelly, but George Kelly, yes. I feel guilt all the time for no reason. The only time I don't feel guilt is when I'm picking, but I'm usually dissociated. What's wrong with my brain? So I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with your brain, but what you wrote here is essentially why I said everything that I was saying in the past hour. When you pick, that usually is a good way to dissociate from intense emotions. So when you can't stand to be with them anymore, sometimes you will resort to picking because for some reason that just blocks everything out. I would not say that you feel guilt for no reason. I don't think that happens. I would rephrase that and say that you're having a hard time figuring out what you feel guilty for. If you remember back in the beginning, when I was telling you about how constructivists see guilt as a kind of information that we are sort of doing the opposite of what we should be doing on a very core, important level, that doesn't have to be triggered by our actual actions in the world. It can also be triggered by what we're thinking about as well. Very, very often people feel guilty about the thoughts that they have. So just last week, I had a session with a client who was terribly upset because she had a very violent thought towards her partner. As a therapist, I've heard far worse, but for her, that was extremely intense and very uncomfortable. And in that moment for my client, there was no difference between thinking something bad and actually doing something bad to someone. Because in effect, they both made her feel guilty. Because her interpretation was, I had this bad thought, therefore I'm a bad person. A constructivist approach to guilt would be, I'm now feeling guilt, let's see why. So I had a bad thought. So I'm the kind of person that equates thoughts and actions. And then you can think about what the differences and similarities are. If you're practicing mindfulness, for example, I think that's the most beautiful lesson about thoughts that you can ever get, is that the more you do mindfulness and the more you learn to observe your thoughts, you will realize that you have the most bizarre thoughts. When I say you, I mean me as well. I've noticed that my brain does contain some very useful information, some very nice stuff, but it's like a repository of different kinds of garbage. Like the stuff that my brain will come up with when I sit and meditate because my daily practice is quite long, so I will meditate for an hour at a time or twice for 45 minutes, for example. And in that time, you will see the weirdest thoughts. And you learn very quickly that there are some thoughts that you very easily recognize as being just absurd, so you don't even react to them emotionally. And then some thoughts you will immediately cling to and feel bad. So guilt is never for no reason. It has to do with how you see yourself. It's just a matter of how much of that you can put into words. It's a long process sometimes to put these things into words because good parts of our identity are not verbal. Kelly talks about how only one small part of our structure, kind of like Freud when he was talking about the iceberg, remember? So for Kelly, that would be whether or not you can express it with words or not, or just other symbols. So most of our identity comes from very early age. When you're little, you don't really think in words. So for example, there are many things about yourself that I know that you can tell me, but you cannot explain why that's the case or how you know that that's true. So for example, your gender identity, that's something that you're something that you're socialized into as you grow up. They teach you what's for boys, what's for girls, and you just sort of accept that when you're little. And even though your parents are probably explaining you things, when you're a kid, you don't really understand any of it because you don't understand words. You just understand this yes, that no. So if I were to ask you to elaborate on some parts of your identity, I'm sure that you would have no idea how to explain them to me because they exist on a level that's not verbal. It takes a long time to be with that and explore it and see how it behaves, to learn how to put that into words to the extent that that's at all possible. I mean, even remember the definition of emotions from the beginning that I gave you by Brown. That's so vague. Now imagine parts of identities that we have that have never been put into words in 30 years. So it's not for no reason, it's just that it takes a while to figure out why. First time on the webinar, not really getting anything out of this. Well, I really am sorry that you're not getting much out of this. I hope you stuck around and I hope you did get something out of it. But you're welcome to ask, I will clarify anything. You mentioned how a Leonard Cohen song type of sadness may mean that you need to say goodbye to someone or something. Just wondering, how does a person tell if they need to say goodbye or if they're rather being avoidant, maybe having anxiety? Well, if you remember, sort of sadness and anxiety would be two very different emotions. So Experientially, you should learn how to differentiate between the two. If you're being avoidant, you will want to retreat from a relationship, but not lose the relationship. I don't know if that is, or at least that would be my distinction and my starting point for thinking about it, is people who are being avoidant. So let's say you're being you cannot stand conflict and you avoid conflict in relationships. So you might avoid your friends for a while because you cannot face anger, guilt, whatever will arise in your argument. But you're not actually breaking up a relationship. You're just waiting for things to cool off so that you can safely come back into the relationship. So saying goodbye to someone is, for example, when someone dies, or when you break up a relationship, or when you're starting to realize that a relationship that you have doesn't work anymore. For that would be for me. But then again, my classification of sadness or different types of sadness is just something that came out of my own experience. It's not a scientific theory. Maybe for you, every sadness is different. When I gave that example, I gave it for the express purpose of encouraging you to explore your emotions in different facets of them. Because whenever you cling to bookish examples of emotions, they can never cover the sort of the vastness of your own experience. So I really like this personalized approach. What happens when you don't have time to think about the emotions and you just pick out of anxiety or sadness and you don't stop even if it's bleeding? I can't stop until it hurts, and then I regret it and start thinking about my emotions, and then it's too late. I think I assumed this was asked before I started talking about any of these techniques. So grounding, rain, all these things you can do without actually sitting down to think about what your emotions mean. Those labeling techniques are also something that you can apply without fully understanding what your emotion is in the moment. Also, you can Google grounding techniques. There are literally dozens of them out there that you can use. I often repeat short song lyrics in my head, such as the first line of a chorus over and over as I pick. It may be something I listened to earlier or completely random. Have you ever come across this? What kind of purpose may this hold? I often don't remember the song after, so I suspect it dissociates me from intrusive thoughts. So this is very interesting, and I have come across similar things, and pay attention if you do that in some other situations as well. So the song, depending on this song selection, I would go in two directions. One would be that you might repeat a song because that song is likely to push you in the direction in which you want to feel. Or you may actually be sort of repeating a song that has an emotional connection to how you're actually feeling and what you don't want to be feeling. But try to remember the song. Just write it down, especially if it seems random. And sometimes you can also observe. So I don't know how many of you have had any experiences with meditation, but not just mindfulness, but other types of meditation like TM maybe. But some types of meditation include you repeating a mantra and repeating it over and over and over and over again. And the way I understand how mantras work is like they just sort of fill up your available mind space so that other thoughts and emotions don't have access there. So it gives you a lot of rest because it kind of banishes or pushes away other thoughts. It kind of creates this space similar to what picking does. So if that's one way that works for you, maybe that's something you can also consider learning. How can someone differentiate between the two? Since you mentioned that equanimity is a positive thing and that in being non-reactive is being proactive, but how does one differentiate the times when they feel they need to leave someone or something versus when they feel afraid? Also, if a person were to feel difficult emotions always in their relationship interaction with someone else, say with a relative or a partner, how does one differentiate when they need to leave the interaction? Well, if all the time and every time you feel very difficult emotion, I would definitely think whether or not it's worth it. I think this is a very complicated question that I understand what you're asking me, sort of, when is it a one-off thing and when is it time to call it quits? And I don't think there's an answer that I can give that would apply to every person out there. This is why I always refer you back to how you feel and how does your body feel, how does your body feel? Because usually the way we know that something is just over is it comes from this place where there are no words, this place of emotions and sensations, and that's where you need to look for it. It's a messy, murky, confusing space, but that's where you go looking for it. I mean, there are some obvious signs that you don't love that person anymore. You know, that's it. But often it comes from this kind of not very verbal space because we don't love with our intellect. I mean, you can love an idea, but even that is not intellectual. There are some ideas that I like. For example, Kelly's theory. When I came across Kelly's theory, I was already sort of in this world, and when I read some parts of his book, I thought, oh my God, where were you my entire life? So there was one part of me that was intellectually intrigued because here was this man who sort of threw out everything that we knew about psychology and built it all over again. So I was intellectually intrigued. But there was something that really resonated with me emotionally. There was something about Kelly's worldview that really sort of syncs up with my worldview. So that's how I knew that it was just a feeling. I'm not advocating that we should make rash decisions in life based on feelings, but what I am saying is that we have to take them into account when we make decisions. Take them as seriously as you would your thoughts when it comes to romantic relationships. Does the age of onset of skin picking determine severity and of longevity of it? If adolescence is known as a time when young people are still sorting out their emotions and learning how to express them, can skin picking emerge as a coping mechanism that diminishes and disappears over time as they learn to manage and address their emotions? Yes, absolutely. So there are several ways that you can look at this. There are some studies that say that BFRBs, so body focused repetitive behaviors, including skin picking, that start in adolescence tend to last longer and are more difficult to treat. That's because they might be associated with some other psychological issues that may arise in this period and that may sort of be lifelong or at least long lasting. But at the same time, on just the level of habit reversal, I think picking that starts in childhood is very stubborn precisely because it was present for so long. If it starts in adolescence, I would say that it's extremely important to address it as soon as possible. That would be my, I think that's how you increase your chances of dealing with it better. But to answer your question, yes. I would refer you to, you can look at the SkinPick's YouTube channel, and there should be a webinar that talks about sort of scientific studies, some of them, about picking, and I think you will find the information you're looking for there. That was last month or the month before. You don't need to worry about going over time. It's a privilege to listen to you speak. Well, thank you, but as you can see, not everyone agrees with that. The reason why I worry about going over time is because I like to leave enough time for your answers. And I understand that, I think last time we went for almost 3 hours and I couldn't speak by the end of it. And I imagine that people who were waiting for 3 hours to hear an answer to their question must have not been very happy. So that's why I was worried about time. But thank you so much. Can you mention the name of the app again? Oh yeah, the app is called SkinPick, exactly like the program. You can go on the website and download it, or you can find it in your Play Store or Apple Store, or however you call that on iPhones. So the app is completely free, and you don't have to pay for the program to use the app. Referring to mindless picking, wearing cotton gloves creates a sensory difference that also works. Oh yes, so gloves in general tend to work. Even though I noticed that when I suggest that to clients, they usually hesitate because they think it looks weird, but they really do work. They're quite effective. And also, like you said, for some people, the sensory aspect of picking is extremely important. And then gloves can provide that sensory satisfaction, which can sort of attenuate or even eliminate the urge sometimes. What you can also do is explore textures around you. Like, for example, this sofa that I'm sitting on has this very nice texture, or like a table. Just, you can notice what is the type of texture that works for you, and then you can find it in different places. So sometimes you may not need to wear gloves. You can just rub something that's around you. Stones can also work well for that as well, or wood. Regarding that, so I have one nice example of, so one client who really was very much attached to that sensory aspect of picking. We talked about how could she find different ways to get that sensory satisfaction. And so initially she considered ordering worry stones, but because they're also very good, something you can rub when you feel the urge. But she wasn't sure, when you order something online, like what will be the texture. And she lived by the sea. Let's not go into more details there. So she just went to the beach, like with the intention of finding a stone that is beautiful and that has the right texture. And so she spent some time exploring different stones on the beach. And she became very attached to the stone that she found. It was a very valuable resource, not just for picking, but also sort of emotionally because of the way in which she chose to find it. So that's one way that you can do that for yourself. You don't have to order everything online. I noticed that when I'm learning, which is what I love to do, I tend to pick as I'm concentrating or focusing or reading. So for example, as I was writing what you were teaching us, I suddenly picked right after I finished writing and tried to pinpoint why I just did that. Is learning a form of stress, even if you enjoy learning something new? Thank you, by the way. Love everyone who goes into psychology and support it always. One thing about stress, the COVID webinar, I think, covers that also. When we talk about stress, colloquially, we will only talk about the bad things, like the exam or some sort of pressure or something unpleasant you have to do at work or anything like that, like difficult family members. So all these things can be stressful. But in terms of what stress is biologically and for our bodies, it's anything that kicks us out of our equilibrium, which also includes good things. I don't know about you, but I like you can tell from this presentation, I'm very reactive to different forms of art. So sometimes when I go to a museum, for example, that will be a beautiful experience for me, but it will also be a very stressful experience because my body becomes at some point exhausted from reacting. I remember the first time I went to Rome when I was in medical school. I think I was just starting. And so I made this huge list of all the things that I need to see, because if you've ever been to Rome, you know that no matter how many times you return, there's still more to see. And so I was supposed to see like 17 Baroque churches in one day, something insane like that. And then at one point, I remember walking into one church, and there was like all these paintings and fat little angels flying around, and Jesus painted in 700 different colors. It's like, I remember my body was literally just stressed. I just felt like I need to get out of here. It's beautiful, but I can't take it anymore. So even when something is beautiful and stimulating, it can be exhausting for our bodies. And if you're not very in tune with your body, or like me in the example from Rome, choose to ignore what your body is telling you and rest because you're greedy and you want to see everything as fast as you can, sometimes you neglect to balance out your stress levels and rest a little bit. What in this specific case, what I would also perhaps think about is what I was talking about when you picked, and maybe how that refers to you in your life. So it could have been a reaction to something, and maybe it's useful for you to learn about yourself. But otherwise, if you pick while you're studying, that could mean that you're tired, you're anxious, you're stressed. So think about that as well. So you're putting too much pressure on yourself in the way that you learn. If you expect yourself to learn everything, for example, the first time you read, or if you expect to get a certain grade or memorize everything, that puts an additional layer of pressure on yourself. So I would maybe look into sort of anxiety management or stress management, or I would find a way to make breaks when I study so that I can be rested for longer periods of time. I have been able to go for 5 or 6 days without picking, but then one day I pick something and it derails me, and the cycle starts over again. What suggestions would you offer me to get back on track without picking more, because I'm upset with myself? So the first thing that I would suggest for you is to study this cycle a little more. If you go 5 or 6 days without picking, and then pick on, let's say, the 7th or the 6th day, the first question for me would be, what happens on that day? And what is it that accumulates all these days that you're not paying attention to and that suddenly sort of explodes? Because sometimes when you feel the urge, you will feel it arise immediately and come out very strongly, and then you're not able to cope with it because it's so intense. But what happens in reality is that if the urge, for example, comes from stress, or you avoiding sadness, or from anxiety that you don't know how to address, this is never sudden. It's always something that happens throughout the 5 or 6 days. And then because you ignore your stress levels or anxiety levels or whatever it may be, you just don't pay attention to that. It's not sort of in your conscious mind, but it still accumulates. And then when it bursts into your consciousness, it comes with full power. So one thing that I would immediately do is focus on how this cycle happens and focus on, let's say, my body or my emotions or my thoughts, and which component is slowly increasing leading to the day when I peak. So that's one thing that I would do. On a more practical scale, what you can do is apply something we call stimulus control techniques. If you can predict more or less when you will pick, you can do many things. So, for example, if you don't pick in front of other people, that's a perfect day to be around other people. If you pick in front of a mirror, cover the mirrors for that day or 2 days. Like dim the lights in the bathroom if you pick in the bathroom, or just find different ways to not tempt yourself to pick. So that's also something that you can do. I think both of these directions are important to explore. When I pick or twirl my hair, I feel almost a chemical release or peacefulness. Is that possible? Well, if you feel it, then yes, that is possible for you. So I always take psychological reality, my own and of other people, as being real for them. Like, take a very radical example, which is a hallucination, for example. So if I hallucinate, obviously none of you will share in my hallucination, mostly. So you're not going to be hearing or seeing what I'm hearing or seeing. But for me, that's undeniably real. And there are some studies that I've seen that show that when a person has a visual hallucination, in their brain, their visual cortex is actually very active. So they are actually seeing it. It is their reality. So if you feel a release and peacefulness, you're absolutely feeling peace and peacefulness and release. And also at another level, every behavior has some sort of biochemical correlate. I mean, that always is, because for example, for me to move my hand up, there had to have been an event in my brain, which is very organic and very real in that sense, right? So that's one thing. Another thing is, obviously, if you need that chemical release, like you call it, and that sense of peacefulness, then that's not something that you have enough in your life. Maybe you can consider how you can introduce that in your everyday life. I don't have any context of your life. I just have the question. So maybe think about that. Like, how else can you introduce that feeling in your life so that picking is not the only outlet for it? How can you be more aware and stop picking when you do it in your sleep? So, well, obviously, you can't be aware of something when you're not aware of it. But what you can do is, for example, use gloves while you sleep. That will at least minimize or eliminate the damage, even if the movements stay. And there's also one thing that I would recommend, without really wanting to make you panic or anything, but I have seen very rarely cases when nocturnal picking is associated with some neurological issues. So if your insurance allows you to do that at no cost or low cost, maybe you can also consult a neurologist as well. I wouldn't expect him to find anything, but just in case, maybe he can do that. I'm triggered by seeing my skin. Is it possible to diminish this reaction besides covering up? So one thing that immediately comes to my mind is the rain technique. Another thing that comes to my mind but I would be very cautious about how I do that. And if there's someone that you trust, maybe you can have that person close to you while you do that, which is to really map out what is it that you're triggered by in your skin. This is very intense. This is why I said that I wouldn't recommend this for everyone, and wouldn't recommend it as a first sort of thing. But the same way that when you're overwhelmed by an emotion, then when you focus specifically on where it is in your body, you kind of minimize it. That way also you can do with your skin. Another thing that you can do is you can sort of introduce a little bit of balance in how you see your skin by trying to intentionally see nice things about your skin. I don't know if you have any skin problems or you don't, but no matter how many problems we have with our skin, we never have problems in our entire skin all the time. So there are always some parts of our skin that are clean, that are clear, that are beautiful. And when you intentionally try to see those as well, you kind of take away some of the power from the triggering parts. I'm currently receiving CBT, but I feel as though it's not fully helping, and it is my severe perfectionism that keeps it going. I know that you recommend ACT a lot. Is this something I can do myself? And do you have any resources you can provide or direct me to? So there are quite a lot of books on ACT, and ACT is also a form of CBT. So for those of you who don't like acronyms, acceptance and commitment therapy is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. ACT is like a newer, upgraded version of CBT. It incorporates mindfulness and sort of emphasizes the concept of experiential avoidance that I've mentioned several times today, and teaches you how to be with your experience. So in addition to the CBT that you're receiving, if you introduce mindfulness practice, for example, that's also something that can help. And I have a slightly unpopular recommendation for this as well, which is it's fine that you work on perfectionism and picking and all that, on a practical level that CBT can offer, but maybe you can also think about, if all of this is financially extremely draining and takes a long time, but maybe a more psychodynamic or insight-oriented therapy could give you a clearer picture about your perfectionism. If that's not something you would do, maybe you can use self-compassion meditations. That's a way to break perfectionism in my experience, because people who are perfectionistic don't tend to have a nice relationship with themselves. Because to expect perfection, you have to be almost cruel to yourself. So cultivating self-compassion can be something that helps. But so if you just go to Amazon, you can find a lot about ACT, really a lot, and also popular science books. So there's quite a lot of material on that. Is skin picking an anxiety disorder? So it's definitely a disorder that has anxiety as its dominant symptom. Yes. I was also wondering about the connection. Is there a significant one linking skin picking to guilt and self-shame? Because I have long experienced guilt and shame since a young age. And I used to self-excoriate, not picking, but squeezing my skin for hours, sometimes up the whole night until dawn. And I could not stop at the time, as it comforted me since I was focusing on drawing something out of my skin. Maybe perceived impurity, but I regretted it afterwards once I saw the damage. So, yes, so again, I don't know much about your situation other than what you just wrote, but I would consider perhaps skin picking as a form to avoid guilt. Because guilt in general is one of the more intense negative experiences that we can have. So even when you cause yourself physical pain, that sometimes tends to be less horrible than just living with guilt. So in that sense, maybe picking gave you a sense of control, maybe it gave you kind of space to rest from guilt. But this is all me hypothesizing, so I don't feel entirely responsible making such beliefs. But definitely, that is something to think about, absolutely. What is your opinion regarding fidget toys? Do you feel they're useful in the treatment of skin picking? Yes, I find that they're very useful, but I don't think that they're like the whole solution. For me, fidget toys have a role to play as a part of competing responses. Competing responses are, again, something that's used in habit reversal training, which would be like the first part of the skin picking program. it is something that's absolutely a necessary step in the treatment because it gives you a degree of control over the urge to pick. So you don't overpower the urge, you don't confront the urge, you don't make it go away. Like we saw here, there's a part of our personality that we just cannot wish away or overpower. But what it does is gives you control in the sense that you redirect the urge to something that causes no damage. So that in itself is a great first step. It's a great first step because, again, gives you a sense of control over the urge since you can redirect it to something else. But at the same time, when you minimize damage that you do on your skin, you also remove a whole layer of triggers. Because for many people, seeing their skin in bad shape is a trigger. And when you allow your skin to heal, that automatically sort of removes a good part of your triggers. So yes, they're useful, but I would not call them a complete solution or even a solution. I would just call them one step towards the solution. I find that picking makes me feel better, almost feels like a relief. Mainly that it feels like my skin is smoother. I do it even though I know I will ultimately make my skin rough and scarred. Will the PowerPoint be available after the presentation so I can remember the references you used? I don't think people from SkinPick will send you the PowerPoint, but they will send you a link when this webinar is uploaded to their website. Since our webinars are becoming increasingly long because of the interest that you have, I mean everyone, and because of the questions, the number of questions that are asked, now they divide them into two. So you will have one video that will be just the webinar, the stuff about managing emotions, and then the second video will be the Q&A. So you will receive a link and you can listen to it over. Is mild picking a cause of concern when there is no significant guilt or shame associated with it? So one thing about disorders like skin picking or hair pulling is that, or even anxiety disorders like generalized anxiety, is that they have to cause some sort of functional impairment. They have to be an obstacle for you. They have to prevent you from doing something. They have to cause some kind of a problem in your life. Otherwise, you can just call it a bad habit. So in that sense, it can be a cause of concern if when you pick, you experience some difficulties in your life, if you cause repeated infections or scarring or something like this. But otherwise, whether or not you wish to work on picking, that's all up to you. And also, let me just expand slightly on that point. Even if something can diagnostically be considered a mental health problem, and if you don't consider it a problem, well, you don't consider it a problem. The same way we want to be better even in those aspects of our lives that are not necessarily in mental disorder, that we can simply choose to grow or not to grow in some direction. That's what I mean. So if you don't want to treat skin picking, then you don't have to treat. And also, I think if you don't consider skin picking a problem and you still start the treatment, then you are less likely to actually benefit from it because you're not willing and you're not motivated to work on it. We frequently have this problem when parents force their kids to participate, well, adolescents to participate in the program. And then what you have is someone who is made to work on something that they don't think they should work on. So obviously they don't feel any motivation to make it. So it often ends up being a colossal waste of time. So unless you feel motivated to work on it, then I don't see how they're. I don't say that like I don't want to help you, but unless you're actually willing to work and try different things, there's no therapist that can go around with you holding your hand. So there has to be internal motivation to change. I want to thank everyone for being in the group and thank you for the webinar. I used to feel very alone and marginalized because most people have never heard of self-excoriation. I used to have it so bad that I'd get open weeping wounds like cellulitis on my face and preorbital cellulitis. So wow, that is quite serious. I've used the picking app in the past. This webinar gave me a lot of hope. Thank you. Well, thank you for your kind words. And I've been thinking about something lately, thanks to the webinars, is that it seems to me that it's very important for people just to share their stories sometimes. And I know that also people like to hear other people's stories. This is why I mentioned the forum and like a place where you can go and share stories. but I'm thinking maybe you're doing something, and I'll see if there's a way that we can arrange for space for you to actually share your stories in real time as well. Because I think that could be quite beneficial. I mean, if I come up with something and if people at SkinPick like it, you will, of course, be notified. I missed the beginning of the lecture. Is the recording available? Yes, I just said that. It will be on SkinPick's YouTube channel. I have picked my skin for almost 14 years. Is it possible to change the conduct? I'm very conscious about it, but it's very hard to stop because it hurts, but makes me feel pleasure at the same time, and I'm used to it. So yeah, of course it is possible to stop. However, I think if you've been picking for a very long time, I don't think it would be productive for you to make it your primary goal to stop immediately, because a habit that goes on for a very long time is very hard to stop, just because it's a habit you do for a very long time. People are creatures of habit, as I say. What I think would be a better step for you is to sort of assess. You can use the SkinPick app, for example, and then assess how much you actually pick per day. And then assess where is it that you absolutely must pick, where is it that you can stop. And then try to reduce by 10 or 20% or something like that per month. See what's realistic for you. Because if you immediately select a goal that's not realistic, or that it's very much down the road, that takes away from your motivation and only adds to the frustration. So if you don't select your goal and strategy correctly, you may actually feel bad and feel like it cannot be changed, whereas it's only the methodology that changes. So you can, but just take it slowly. You mentioned transference. Could you please explain a little bit about what's going on if you're finding yourself attracted to your therapist, and how to deal with that besides talking to the therapist, because I'm no longer seeing them? So that's called erotic transference, and that's quite a complicated topic. There, of all the literature that I've read on the subject, and since I'm a nerd, I did read a lot, almost all of it is psychoanalytic. So usually you're not, just let me put it bluntly, you're not in love or attracted to your therapist because you don't really know your therapist. What you're in love with and what you're attracted to is how you see your therapist. So even when your therapist shares something of their personal experience, you're always deprived of the wider context, so to speak. So the therapist does it as a learning lesson, not because you're getting to know their personality. So what you are attracted to is your projection. It's what you see in your therapist. That's one very good example of transference. And what I would do is, if you start a therapy with another therapist, which would be advisable in this situation, in some instances, when it comes to erotic transference, there's a way to work through that. But unless the therapist is experienced, I think in more intense cases, it is, and if the client cannot really mentalize and talk about that, it's smarter to just stop therapy and start with someone else. And because once you get stuck in a certain form of transference that's very intense, it can hinder your progress in therapy. So if you start talking to another therapist, that's something where I would start with, and I would explain how I felt, and I would explore that a little bit, because it is definitely something yours, like it's your psychology. It has very little to do with your therapist. Okay, so this is someone's correction on the website. Do you have any suggestions for accepting emotions that arise from picking, rather than those that are contributory to picking? So I suppose you mean like guilt and shame that come afterwards, and yes, I do. What I would do is, since I'm very inspired by mindfulness, so what I would do is I would practice, for example, forgiveness or self-compassion, because when you pick, so that causes a lot of pain. Physical pain and mental pain as well. And also it predisposes you to pick further, because you've just created a wound which will become a scab, which will probably tempt you to pick. That's a difficult situation to be in. When you feel guilt and shame, and then you cling to that guilt and shame and feel horrible, you're adding another layer of suffering, of completely unnecessary suffering on top of suffering. There is a way to acknowledge picking as something that's wrong, and accept it as a part of you that you wish to change, without punishing yourself by holding on to guilt and shame. So one thing that you can do is try to be kind and compassionate to yourself, and you can do that by trying to actively let go of negative emotions by using any of the techniques that I suggested before, or by simply taking care of your skin. That's also a very good way to do it. Another way is to try to proactively limit your picking and just say, okay, I will pick for 5 minutes and then stop, and then do whatever you can to minimize the damage. Because that way you have given in minimally to the urge, how much sort of the least amount that you possibly could have. But at the same time, you have done everything to limit it, and you have done everything you can to make sure that your skin doesn't get infected and that it heals fast. So that's one way that you can minimize those intense emotions. But in the long run, I would go with self-compassion, for example, because self-compassion is essentially generating this attitude that you want to suffer less. So you will automatically learn how to let go of these difficult emotions. Are we processing emotions in the first hour of sleep? I get nocturnal panic attacks within the first hour of falling asleep on occasion. Do any of these techniques work as a preventative method to that? So dreams are really very complicated. So from a therapeutic point of view, dreams are, for me at least, incredibly useful and beneficial to work with. Because, you know, Freud once said, and I will probably butcher the quote because I've been talking for too long, he said something like the dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, basically. And that in our dreams, we learn how to symbolize in very weird ways what we cannot articulate with words or what's entirely unacceptable to actually even say or think. So in that sense, dream symbolism is very important for therapy because you learn about some things that there's no other conscious access to that. I don't know that you can do much with your dreams as you fall asleep, unless you're one of those very talented people who can learn how to lucidly dream very quickly. What you can do is you can maybe try to take care of your environment before you go to sleep. So make sure that your phone is not in the same room where you are. These sort of basic things about sleep hygiene. Try to give yourself regular sleep rhythm, establish a pattern, make sure to relax before you fall asleep. You can even use some of those self-hypnosis or mindfulness for sleeping. And then maybe you will fall asleep in a slightly calmer state of mind. So then this wouldn't happen. But whatever you do in that instance would be basically before sleep. Because, I mean, again, unless lucid dreaming is your thing, I don't know how else you can modify it. I found your personal examples really helpful. Thinking about my own thinking or emotions seems so overwhelming. Any suggestions on simplifying? So once you start becoming overwhelmed, if those are emotions, you have grounding, for example. If it's thoughts, just take a piece of paper and just jot everything down. Or try not to follow all the thoughts. Try to focus on specific themes that keep repeating themselves. That's one way in which you can simplify it. But for me, when it comes to working with thoughts, in general, I'm the kind of person that likes to think a lot. So for me, I really don't know what would be overthinking. For me, there's just methodic thinking and thinking that's not very useful or very methodic. When I think, I like to have a system how I think. And so if I see my mind rushing and just jumbling things up, I will pause, ground myself in my body, and then focus on what was the topic of my thoughts. If I can, I will leave it for later, but if I must think through it, I will apply a system. I have this kind of, it takes too much time now to explain how I like to analyze my problems, but I basically have my own way of doing a cost-benefit analysis when I make decisions or when I have to think things through. And then I just sort of calmly apply that. But first, I ground myself because that allows me to detach from my thoughts. I have to leave now, but thank you so much. Looking forward to the next webinar. You're welcome and looking forward to having you there. I found it. Okay, thank you. I don't always read I read all the compliments that you say, but I feel weird reading compliments to me out loud because it sounds like I'm bragging and it makes me feel very unpleasant. But thank you very much. It's much appreciated. Um, I found some suggestions interesting and I will explore them. Thank you. Do you have any suggestions for picking when I first wake up and I'm not fully awake yet? I would try sleeping with the gloves on. That's one thing that I would do. And then as I get out of bed, I would start my day by, for example, doing something that would relax you and put you know right state of mind, let's say. For me, that's mindfulness, but for some people, it can be coffee or whatever ritual you might have in the morning. But I would sleep with the gloves on because that should be quite effective. I know some of the reasons why I pick my skin. One, my hands always have to be busy, not doesn't have to be skin picking. Two, I think I literally enjoy it. Three, there's a satisfaction in collecting as much picked skin as possible or as big a piece as possible. Will methods here help for this, or should I look elsewhere? So some of the methods that I meant, I think what I was talking about in the webinar, in the sort of the lecture part of the webinar, might not necessarily help unless you can apply these techniques to the urge itself. But if your hands always have to be busy, then you can benefit from competing response techniques. If you enjoy picking, then you would benefit from is finding what feels similar. So another type of competing response, let's say. And the satisfaction in collecting as much skin as possible, I would really need to sort of get to know and explore that a little more to be able to know what that means for you specifically. So some of the methods you can apply, but maybe not all of them. If you're thinking about joining the program, then you might find helpful techniques there. Otherwise, you can just Google habit reversal, for example. That should definitely have something. I find that I pick when I'm really tired. Instead of going to sleep, I stay up and pick, which can last 1 to 2 hours. It feels like self-sabotage. Is this a common theme of picking? Yes, actually, this is extremely common that people will pick when they're tired. And a very, very simple reason for this is that all our defense mechanisms tend to just fall apart or weaken anyway. Any force of will that you normally have, you don't have it. Sometimes you don't really even care about anything when you're tired. So that is basically the perfect timing for picking to arise, because all your typical mechanisms of dealing with it will be either inefficient or less efficient. So yes, that happens very frequently. Also, all the emotions that you suppress when you're awake will probably show up when you're tired. And also that's one moment when you might resort to being. Freud wrote somewhere, I don't really remember the exact reference, so I'm really sorry that I can't give you a specific place to look for it, but he once said that suppression as a defense mechanism requires a lot of energy. So it's not easy to push away and keep all your emotions away and all the unpleasant things away. So that alone can make you tired. And then when you are tired, you will not have the energy necessary to maintain the suppression, and then everything will just come back into your consciousness. So yes, in this case, I think it's a matter of maybe how you organize your day and what you can do to prevent being in a situation that you're tired and with no structure, for example. That's one of the things that are very common, but also very easy to deal with in terms of that they require lifestyle changes, not necessarily deep psychological exploration. I just wanted to say, whoever took the time to write first seminar, I learned nothing. That was pretty rude considering the time it took to teach us. So I don't think that's what they meant. I just think they meant that at the time when they were writing the comment, they didn't find anything useful. So maybe the comment was written in the beginning when I was talking about what emotions are. Maybe that just wasn't new for them or useful for them. On the other hand, maybe I really didn't convey things as clearly as I thought I did. But it's always my intention. I like to start from theory sometimes because I think it's important to give you where my reasoning comes from. If I just start by saying, well, guilt is when you make a mistake and then you do the opposite of what you were supposed to do, that doesn't really give you a lot of context. It's just a meaningless instruction. So I prefer to give this kind of introduction. I can try to be maybe more concise next time, but I didn't take it as offensive. But thank you for speaking up for me. Is there a connection between a parent squeezing on blemishes on their child when they're young and that child growing up and squeezing or excoriating? I have I'm not sure. I didn't ask for permission from my client to share this, so I'm going to skip what I have in my mind. But yes, I think one place where you can go to find the explanation is how you would feel when your mom would do that, or parent. I'm sorry, I just assumed it was a mom. When your parent did that, and also, so how we form meaning is sometimes intentional and sometimes it's contingent on many different things. So the question is, when your mom would pick your mom again, maybe I should just text my mom after this. So when your parent was squeezing your blemishes, how did I understand that at the time? Did I understand that as a punishment, as care, as a way to make them prettier, or whatever? So this is the line of thinking that I would go down. I'm trying to see if I can give a personal example to illustrate my point. That's not very personal, and I can't find one. But there's one that's personal, as in my dog's example. So my dog has a fear of cats and also has a fear of one part of the street that we live in. Because when she was very young, there was a building that was being constructed there, and a cat just jumped out at my dog. And so my dog just doesn't go to that part of the street anymore. She was a puppy, like 5 months old. And like when we go out of the building, she will always go left, never right. The rule. She just doesn't go there. And so there's nothing intrinsically dangerous about that part. But for her, I suppose, scary and going right sort of remain connected until this day. She's, of course, a dog, so she can't go to therapy, doesn't have the necessary skills to reflect on that. But this is how also we adults connect meaning to situations. It's oftentimes intentional, but sometimes these things happen as well. And then we connect this to something pleasurable or painful, and that continues to live on in our lives. So maybe that's the way you can think about that. I have to leave. Thank you so much. A brilliant session. Well, you're welcome. Thank you. Could transference happen in other relationships as well? How would I recognize it? How do I know if I actually love someone or if this is just a transference of them? My God, that's like, I don't think you could have asked me a more difficult question. I honestly have no idea. I could just give you a lot of stuff that Jacques Lacan wrote about transference in love, and that would not be useful for anyone. That's a very smart question and a very difficult one, and I have no idea how to answer that. At that level of enlightenment is not something that I have reached yet, but transference does happen all the time. So we always, you can look at it this way. In the beginning, I basically said that our worldview is shaped by our constructs, and our constructs come from our experience, right? So whenever you hear the news or hear someone talk or share something, it is always filtered through your constructs, unless you make a conscious effort to inquire about the constructs of the other person. And even then, you're filtering that through your prism. So we can't really have a neutral observer kind of position. That's just not possible for humans, especially not when it's about us. So we always see things through transference. There is a difference between that and the specific subtype, let's say, of that phenomenon in therapy. Transference in therapy is extremely intense because you never know your therapist, and yet you feel an intimate connection to them, or at least you share very intimate things. So all your worst fears about rejection, not being good enough, all these things intensify to a huge degree in the therapeutic setting, or at least in specific types of therapy. So to be perfectly honest, certain types of CBT don't really sort of emphasize transference that way, but psychodynamic and insight-oriented therapies and psychoanalysis work very much with that. And it's a part of the therapeutic process to intensify that. Because when you don't know someone, you don't know what they think, and every anxiety you have will just explode. And that this is how you become more aware of these problems, and this is how you can work on them. Whereas with other people, it's always slightly muted, let's say, because we know that not everything is about us, and we know some of their points of view, and sort of it's like a weaker version of transference. But yes, the mechanism is the same. For the love part, I mean, good luck. If you figure out the answer, email me. I have severe chronic pain, not the mind-body syndrome kind. Do you have any suggestions for managing skin picking during pain flares? It doesn't work to map my body or meditate during pain flares because the only way out of the pain is dissociation. So I understand why that would be the default way of getting out of the pain, but there are mindfulness-based approaches to chronic pain as well. So of course, I don't know the intensity of your pain, so I don't know if that would apply to you, but maybe that's something that you can seek out. I don't teach mindfulness for chronic pain, so I don't feel qualified to help with that specific part because it is something that requires, I think, not just specific mindfulness training and experience, but also a lot of knowledge of neurology and just the specific issue that you're facing. So there are many types of chronic pain, so I wouldn't feel qualified to give you advice. But yes, you can use mindfulness. You just have to learn how to adapt that. And also in those instances, I would just go for the most rudimentary things like repeating response, for example, or wearing gloves. And also I would strongly suggest that you see if there's a medical way, non-addictive medical way to manage your pain. And I'm sorry, I can't give you a more detailed answer. It's a very, very specific question. After finding your website recently, it was such a relief to put a name to what I experienced. I take Effexor 325 milligrams in the morning and Trazodone 150 milligrams at night for other issues. I see the psychiatrist every 3 months, mainly for renewal of meds. The last appointment was over the phone, and I told him about this condition. He was going to research this condition before our next appointment. He mentioned Prozac. Would that be helpful? At present, I'm not in therapy. Overall, psychotherapy is more effective than medication for skin picking. So that's really all I have to say. So with Prozac, it's prescribed sometimes, although there's not a lot of evidence that it's extremely effective. On the other hand, Prozac is not a drug that has very serious and intense side effects, so I don't think you lose much by trying. I would, however, recommend psychotherapy of some kind in combination if you want to take medication as well. NAC, the supplement, can work with some people. So medication with skin picking, unfortunately, is not very effective. This is another. Thank you. Thank you so much for your thoughtful answers. You're welcome. So we have a few more questions, and we have been going on for 2.5 hours now, and you keep posting new questions, which I don't mind, but I just don't think we can make it with all of them. So my idea is that we can bring this to an end now, and you can email me any questions that you have. My email is right there. If you have any questions about the program, you can contact our support. And there's also an option, I think they will send you an email with the ability to schedule a consultation call with me, but those calls are related to the program. So if you have any questions, you can also ask them that way, whatever is easier, more pleasant for you. And I would like to thank you for sort of coming and asking all these questions and participating so actively. Next time we will talk about mindfulness and peaking. And I hope to see, or at least hear from you, if not see you. So thank you and have a pleasant evening.